You are live.
All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the September CAG meeting. We have a very robust CAG meeting planned for the next 2 days. And I'd like to take this time to welcome our participants. We have Tom Stevenson, the IAASB chair, Lynn Dewey, the deputy of the IAASB, and Galen Hansen, the IAASB CAG chair. And congratulations, Galen, on your reappointment. We'd also like to recognize the PIOB observer, Dave Sullivan. Welcome, Dave. We have some official observers, Barbara Benich of the PCAOB and George Cobway of the IMF. And other observers, of course, Don McLeachy of IFAC's Small and Medium Size Practice Advisory Group. Those that were not able to attend today have sent their apologies. And at this point, I'm going to ask the IAASB chair, Tom, if you have any opening comments.
I have, first of all, welcome. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We're prepping hard for our board meeting next week, too. So this meeting is particularly timely. And it's timely because we're at really critical junctures from a substantive standpoint on a very full work program right now. So we really value your input today on that, and we look forward to hearing your advice. Secondly, I should say, I don't know if he's joined the call yet, but he will shortly. I should note, many of you know our Managing Director, James Gunn. Today, he celebrates 2 decades of service to international standard setting. So I just wanted to note that for the record, and please, when you speak to him next, congratulate him and thank him for his service to the cause of high quality global standards. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Tom. And of course, no meeting would be complete without a discussion of the minutes. The minutes were distributed, I believe, on June the 28th. And there was a marked up version, which was circulated on August 19th. And I want to submit those for approval. If there are any additional comments on the minutes, otherwise we will approve them. Anyone? All right, so approved. And we have a packed agenda today. First, we're going to hear about LCEs. It's a report back. As you know, the standard, the exposure draft went out, and I think you'll find it very interesting. Fortunately, we have Kai Morton again here to talk about the LCE exposure draft and the feedback. So Kai, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thank you, Jim, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all. Happy to be back talking about LCE with this group. Last time we spoke were September 21. At that point, we had just released the ED of the standard, and we're busy performing different activities to promote the ED and to ensure that we get plenty of responses. So Michelle, could you go to the next slide? As you see from this slide, we were successful in obtaining responses. We did quite a lot of outreach. We had 24 different organized events, roundtables, presentation, and linking live sessions. Within those, there were also a few live presentations. Most of it was done since it was in the COVID restriction time, it was done virtually. With those activities, we reached more than 90 countries. In addition, we also had a survey together with IFAC that we gathered more than 250 responses. In May 2022, we now had our 3rd version of the Paris conference, giving some feedback of the ED, and then also gathering some input on the way forward. in that conference, we had more than 130 participants, some both being some physical and also virtual participants. As for comment letters, we received 145 letters, which is a substantial number. That also being said, there were different views on what we did receive. It was not a clear steer in either direction. What we did was then analyzing the direction of the comments and try to identify some key themes that we needed to discuss with the board on how to further approach the ISA for LCE standard, which we then did in June this year. So if we go on to the next slide, the key themes that we did identify based on the comments. The first one was not really a question we separately had in, as I said, we're not a clear steer. There were comments both supporting the project and some not supporting the project. It was not a specific question we had in the ED itself, but we did go around with the board based on the comments we received on how we should progress, and the direction from the board was to progress the standard, trying to address the comments, and both addressing comments from those supporting the project and those not supporting, to how we could best address them. The key themes that we did identify was around the nature of the standard. Should it still remain a standalone standard? As you know, it's been designed to be separate from the ISAs. And the direction is that we will remain standalone. One of the other areas we heard both from some of the respondents supporting the standard, but also from the ones not supporting the standard, was how we can more directly how to say this, in some areas in designing the standard, we had scoped out complex areas like around estimates, and some of the feedback we received was saying that for example, estimates may not be an area that's a good distinguisher of a complex entity. You could have an estimate that could be more or less complex without the entity itself being more complex. So we're exploring how we could change the approach around estimates to include how to address some of that. The other areas were then around the basis for the design of the standard. That's including one of the favorite topics to discuss, authority and scope, and who is this standard really for? What's the nature of the audits or the LCEs that could use this standard? So how can we further one of the other areas, both from the ones supporting and from the ones not supporting, we're saying that the standard is very similar to what we have in the ISAs. So we were pushed to see how we could further differentiate from the ISAs, and some specific areas were highlighted where we should explore further differentiation. Some of that being specifically around the controls, both how much you need to understand, and then how to address some of that. That was some of the feedback we did hear. The other part of that was also the approach of not including application material, but that we have essential explanatory material, and whether that is that approach is we should continue with that or not, and that's on balance. We got support for continuing the similar approach that we have, but in some areas there is more EM to be included, and in addition to that, there will also we're working on how to give additional guidance or maybe examples outside of the standard, not being part of the standard itself, which could also give more help and support for practitioners when using the standard. In this area also, we did get some questions on both linked to this and to the standalone, that the standard was designed to be standalone and not allowed to top up by pulling in requirements from the standard, from the ISAs. And there was a, let's say, misconception that you were not allowed to use the ISAs as support when doing the standard. That is not the intention. It's never been the intention. We always know the ISAs are there and that it could provide very helpful context and help and guidance for the practitioners. So we've tried to also address that in the redrafting of what we're doing currently. The other area, as I said, favorite topic, authority scope. There is some mixed feedback. I think on balance, what we're seeing is that we're hearing it's too open. There's too much judgment. And some specific questions that I'll come back to later on as well. But our approach is how we can better describe who the standard is for, and then also exploring some how quantitative thresholds could be used by jurisdictions. The last one here of the key themes was one area where we got the strongest agreement, I think, from the respondents. There were some that did not respond to this question at all, but from the ones that did respond, there was a strong push to include audits of group financial statements in the standard. And then with the discussion we had with the board, we were exploring how that could be included and presented in the standard. As you see later on in the authority, we will then also added some specific group-specific characteristics in the authority to describe decide whether you could use the standard or not. So if you go on to the next slide, Michelle. This slide is here just to show how we feel the authority or the scope was interpreted by the respondents of the ED. As you see on this, we have from the least complex entity ranging up to the most complex entity, and then also with listed entity or entities with public interest characteristics. Based on the understanding of the ED responses, we saw that there was such a wide range on how people interpreted the scope, and that was all maybe also one of the reasons why we did get such a mixed feedback on some of the details in the standard itself. To address some of that, we are now trying to get more firm in our description or in the authority, so we have a better common understanding who the standard really is for. By doing that, it also would allow us to differentiate a bit more from the ISAs themselves when we have a better common understanding who the standard is for. If you go on to the next slide. This slide shows some of the proposed changes to the authority that we have done. In the papers you received for this meeting, there is agenda item B3 that shows proposed authority with changes that has been suggested for this. That includes changes around qualitative characteristics. Changes there. The feedback we got, as I said, was that it's too open and too much judgment included and difficult to decide whether you're in or out. We also have described what is not a less complex entity rather than describing what is.
How to host emerging markets, and in many cases there are liquidity.
Can you hear me now?
We can still hear you, CAG.
Okay, thanks. We had described what what is a complex entity rather than describing what is a less complex. So we flipped that around, trying to describe what a less complex entity is rather than the opposite. And we have also done some changes to some of the individual characteristics. One of the changes following that we are suggesting or group audits to be included is that the limitation or the prohibition for group audit has been removed. We have changed the content around a little bit in the standard, so it's more similar to some of the other parts in the standard itself. Moved some of the content to EEM, and then also clarified other topics not to be included, as we have designed the standard not to address. If you're intending to rely on internal controls, for example, then that content is not. Or not internal controls, but internal audit. That content has not been included in the standard, and we try to highlight that a bit more. The other discussion we've had, also based on the responses to the ED, was around quantitative thresholds. The standard has always been designed around the qualitative characteristics, whether you're less complex or not. Given that we're still receiving quite a different interpretation on what is the scope of the standard, there is a feeling that we need to have a backstop in there saying, yes, it is about whether you're less complex or not, but in that judgment, size somehow matters, that there is a room on how you can cap the use of the standard. We had long discussions both in the with the NSS and in the Paris conference and with the board how that should be done. We've added a placeholder in the standard for now on that jurisdictions can add in their own quantitative thresholds, and then also included guidance for them on how to determine the thresholds. It is an area where we've gotten mixed feedback, but most of what we're hearing is that there is a place for quantitative thresholds, but it's for jurisdictions to set them and decide how it can be done. If you go on to the next slide. As I said, we've now suggested to include group audits in the standard. The way that has been done is that we've added it as a consideration. First, you need to comply with all the prohibitions and qualitative characteristics being an LCE, and then we have some group specific characteristics. As you see on the right hand side and in the document received, it's around the group structure and activities, access to information and people, consolidation process, and financial reporting process. Are areas where we have identified there is some group specific characteristics. I think by that we can go to the next slide, which is also the first question for you, and then asking you for views on the proposed changes to the authority that's included in A3 or B3 in the agenda item, including the approach and the changes for group audits in the authority. So I'll hand back to you, Jim.
Thanks, Kai, and certainly for LCE, the CAG has been very vocal, at least historically, so I imagine you're going to get some feedback today. Very interesting that you received the feedback from the draft, as you had indicated. So, well, first up, we recognize Paul Thompson. Paul, go ahead.
Thanks, James. Can I just first of all check that you can hear me, because I've had a few issues with my microphone.
Paul, hey, Paul, you're going in and out. You might check your mic.
Okay, if I come closer, I might take off the video. I'm having a few problems with the microphone on my laptop. Well, let me start by congratulating the team on the project so far. I think it's come a long way and has been significantly improved from what was discussed in Paris in early May. I think from our side, EFA for SMEs, who were present and participated at that event in Paris, we're very happy with the main changes that have been made, in particular the reference to quantitative thresholds, the inclusion of group audits, because that makes it now much more useful to many more SMEs. Just really a couple of quite minor comments, certainly in the introduction, when there's reference to what entities, what types of entities can use it. The way it presently reads, it almost as if groups are not included. There's like a list, and as far as I recall, I just found it not especially clear in the wording as to the inclusion of group audits, despite the fact that a little bit further up it does say that groups are scoped in. So I just wonder whether that was worth looking at. I also noticed still a couple of references. There are a few references to numbers. As I recall, in the list of characteristics of a typical LCE for the purpose of determining the appropriate use of it. Page 4 of B3, there is something referred to as nature of the finance function. And there's reference to generally 5 individuals or less. I guess I'm just a little bit wary about using these numbers in this context. And I just wondered, in the case of the finance function, whether we should be saying something like there's lack of separation of duties because the entity is so small. But that was just some minor thought. So congratulations to the team on this.
Thank you, Paul. Mr. Yoshi. Or Akihito, comments?
Thank you. Kai, thank you very much for your presentation. As IOSCO mentioned in the comment letter, we continue to have concerns about developing the separate standard. And this proposal, that is the additional consultation about Part 10 group audit, makes this LC project longer. So much more additional resources will be needed for this LC project. Under this situation, our concerns may be increasing than ever. IAASB has many important projects for including the audit of listed entities, such as sustainability assurance, fraud, going concern, audit evidence. Particularly, sustainability assurance is a very urgent issue. Therefore, I do not believe that the IAASB's valuable resources should be spent on the LCE project anymore. My suggestion is that it would be useful to summarize the knowledge and findings which are helpful for the practice for LC audit accumulated so far in the LC project as guidance. That's my comment. Thank you.
Akihito, thank you for your perspective. Kazuhiro.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Kai. This time, there is a proposal to include group audits in the scope of application of LC, but I disagree with it. I'm concerned that it will become possible to apply LC to unlisted financial institution groups. For example, listed companies are exempt from the LCE, but PIEs that are not listed companies are not necessarily exempt from the LCE. Financial institutions that meet paragraph A1C paragraph A1C on page 2 of agenda item B3 are excluded. Although there are financial groups that don't meet this definition. Recently, some companies have started offering services similar to financial services, such as offering a variety of online payment services. If such a firm is an unlisted company, the provisions of A1C do not necessarily exclude it from the scope of the LCE, nor does it necessarily exclude the group audit of that company from the LCE. Possibly such financial groups may be exempt from LCE application judgment by the qualitative characteristic of business requirements set out on page 4 and 5 of the agenda item. However, I think that the judgment of what kind of business should be excluded from the scope of LCE must be subjective. If the business is being developed as a group, the structure of the business should be somewhat complicated. So with regard to the scope of application of LCE, it would be better to assume that it is not applied at least to group audits, and the scope of application of LCE will become clearer. Otherwise, I fear the provisions regarding the definition of LCE will become increasingly complex and difficult to understand, or the scope of application can be expanded arbitrarily. Thank you.
Thank you, Kazuhiro. Don.
Thanks, Jim. The S&P agrees with the changes, including the removal of the group audit limitation and the description of what is less complex. My understanding is that they're still looking at the changes to the individual characteristics, so we might have some further feedback for you, excuse me, on that aspect at some point, but we certainly wanted to express our support and agree with the direction of travel thus far.
Thank you. We're getting a diversity of views here. Conchita, how are you?
Hi, thank you. I would like to thank the presenter. I join the others in saying that the presentation now shows a lot of improvement from the last time that we discussed this topic. I would like to express my appreciation also on the limitations set for the application for LCEs, and they are classified into 3 categories, but perhaps more clarifications should be done so that clarity is assured. Thank you.
Thank you, Conchita. Hilda.
Good afternoon to all, and thank you, Kai, for your presentation. At Accounts Europe, we are supportive of the proposals that you have been making on the authority, and we're particularly happy that non-complex groups will now be considered to be in the scope. And you know, Accounts Europe presents auditors and accountants who work with all sorts of entities, listed ones, medium-sized ones, small ones, and you know, it's really from a practical point of view that we believe this is important. There are, in Europe at least, a lot of very small entities that need an audit. Small and less complex is not the same, but oftentimes there is an overlap, and I think there is a real demand for this standard to be continued and to be finalized, and also for groups to be addressed, because often we have in Europe very small entities, but for commercial reasons they are set up in another country with a branch or a subsidiary. So there would be an involvement of consolidation. And so that would make them often be a group. So we believe that that should be included. But, I think the authority, how you have ring fenced it, really makes it focused on less complex groups. So we're supportive. Thank you.
Thank you, Hilda. Klaus.
Yes, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. And thank you, Kai Morten, for your presentation. I want to join the group of supporters for the travel direction of the project. Business Europe is very happy with the now proposed amendments compared to the exposure drafts. We welcome the removal of limitation of group audits, which I think is very helpful. I think what Hilde just alluded to is also relevant from our perspective. We also are pleased with the development regarding the qualitative characteristics, that with this new approach, instead of trying to describe what's less complex, there might be further work needed to do on the details of that in order to make it operational, but keeping that aside, we're very supportive of that. We're also very supportive of that. You also signal that you could use quantitative thresholds in jurisdictions and for regulators, because I think that's, from a practical standpoint, is needed in order to make this operational. So to sum up, we're very happy with the direction of travel right now. Thanks.
Thank you, Klaus. Okay, Kai, I think you've received a number of comments, and I will turn it back to you for some perspectives.
Thank you. I think as the comments we received also shows that there are different opinions on some of these questions, and that is what we're trying to tackle and deal with also going forward. Just to respond to some of the both support and concerns around group audits, what we are trying to address are, as Hilda and some of the others said, the really less complex groups. In some jurisdictions, they may not exist. Other jurisdictions may, for business or regulatory reasons, be set up as groups just because of that, and not because of complexity as a whole. And there may be also statutory audits or audits performed on some of those really less complex groups, and it's those groups we're trying to address and include in some of this, that the groups that are really less complex and not widening the scope of the standard as such. Some of the concerns here, I think, with both the other prohibitions and limitations, including qualitative characteristics, we're hoping to, or what we're trying to do is exclude groups that would be complex. If it was financial institutions or some others that are not, it's not trying to bring them back in with the group complex. It's trying to address some of those. Other than that, yes, there is still some work to be done on some of these authority areas. We did get some helpful suggestions and comments on some of how that could be evolved further. But very happy to receive both support and challenges. That is what will bring this standard forward and bring us to a good result at the end.
Great, thank you, Kai.
If there are no other comments or questions, I can move on to the next slide.
Yes, go ahead.
The next topic is then around the suggested content that we have included for audits of group financial statements. We've done, the research we've done is looking deeply into the ISO 600 or the group audit requirements in the ISOs, and then trying to identify what are the requirements that would be relevant and appropriate for the less complex groups. And a typical less complex group, some of them we've scoped out because it would not be relevant in a less complex group. We have then drafted that into a separate part, I think in the documents you received, it's B2. You can see the suggested part 10 of the standard itself. On there we deal with the requirements on what would be necessary to do an audit of a less complex group. It's not complete, as we have not included all the essential explanatory material that would be included. And this is the, let's say, our first full draft that we're taking to the board to get their feedback on, and it will continue being brought back to the board in the December meeting. So it's the first full draft, and that will continue to evolve. So as you see there, the requirements have been put into the separate part. Some of the requirements that would be relevant in an audit of a less complex group are already addressed in some of the other parts of the ISAs, and we then may refer back to them or highlight them through the standard itself. So it's not doubled up. I think by having this as one standard, it also gives us the ability not having to refer back and forth all the time, but that we deal with some of the content in the area where it's necessary. One of the areas that we've been struggling with, and there is concerns in both directions and questions whether to include or not, are audits of groups where there is use of component auditors. It is one that we've been discussing quite a lot in our task force. Currently, on balance, what we have, our suggestion is, or in the draft, we have included the content. It's been highlighted with the background color to say that if we're not including component auditors, that part would go out. The discussions we've had is, in most cases, not saying all, but in a very high percentage of group audits that are truly less complex groups, we believe that in those areas it's not that common to have component auditors. Yes, there could be some situations, but generally it's not. It's one question we're bringing to the board, and also asking you here on some of this view, but we're asking the board if we're to exclude component auditors in the draft, because it would both include, or it could move to the scale to some more complex audits. I think also some of the situations we've heard where there is use of component auditors in less complex groups may not be a truly less complex situation. It's more of a use of another auditor, and that's a concept we will then try to address through some of that. So if you move on to the next slide, that's the next question. So asking you for views on the drafting in part 10, and then also including your views on use, whether the standard should include use of the component auditors or not. So back to you, Tim.
Thank you, Kai. Any perspectives on this particular topic, Hilda?
Thank you. On your question, Kai, on component auditors, as indicated before, because even in less complex groups, there can be entities geographically dispersed, we believe that you should consider the inclusion of component auditors. So hopefully that will not make it too complex. So hopefully that works out. On part 10, because it's the first draft, because it's not fully complete, we haven't really gone into detail, so no comments in particular at this point in time. On any other matters, when we look at the LCE in general, simplification is a very important objective, and if you could still consider, if there is further simplification needed related to or possible related to the risk the identification and assessment, like more a one-step approach than the current two-step approach. We would think that's a good thing to consider. And as far as simplification, potentially also related to documentation, there might be scope for further simplification. Thank you.
Thank you, Hilda. Hussein.
Thank you. I personally and as a representative for IASCO, we are not supportive of a separate standard set, but I see that it's inevitable. There is some, especially stakeholder from European side demands separate standards. Therefore, I think this project is going on, and for this project, I think the major approach should be that this standard should be simple version of ISA, original ISA. Therefore, this part should be consistent with ISA 600. If component auditor is in ISA 600, therefore it should be also here, I think. For wording, it's useful to, this is for less complex entities, therefore language of this part and all other parts should be simple. I see very long sentences with relative clause. Also, I see that, for example, paragraph 10.31, group auditors shall take responsibility. I think here wording should be auditor shall do that, shall perform that, like that. There is no need to state shall take responsibility. This is standard require auditor to perform audit procedure. Therefore, for especially performing audit procedure or obtaining audit evidence, statement should be say that auditor should do that, perform that, like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Hussein. Okay, now I have heard from about 6 or 7 of the CAG members, which means I have about another half I have not heard from. And so I would like to just continue to open this up, if you don't mind, Kai, to hear from those who have not responded, if they had just have any general comments, and we'll open it up, not just this question, but some of your earlier questions with the feedback. Just either some support or reservations or whatnot. I would appreciate it from those who we've not heard from. This is your chance. Tyson? Who else is showing up on my screen?
Yes.
Anyone? Any comments?
Yeah, I do not have any comment, but I fully support the idea of including in the scope to somehow even the less complex group audits, which is in case of SMPs is important, because if these are excluded, that will create a negative position, concentration in the market. So I agree with what has been included and the improvements made in this standard.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Paul? Yeah, this is an area where I don't know that I have a lot of deep perspective, but I will say, probably more in response to the last question, that I like the direction this is going. I appreciate how much work is going into this, but I think it's a very well thought out and measured approach that will ultimately make whatever changes, standards, or new guidance much more helpful. So again, no specific concerns, but do want to applaud the direction as a whole. Thank you, Paul. Daniel.
Hi, everybody. Yes, I think it's very important to include component auditors, especially in my jurisdiction. It's very common to have statutory auditors, and even in SMEs. So it's important to include component auditors in this standard. So I support that. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Daniel. And Galen?
Yeah, thank you. I do have similar sentiments as Paul expressed. I think there's a practical response here. Conceptually, I've never been in favor of sort of dual approaches based on the differences that we're talking about here. And I would have to say overall, I agreed with one of the earlier comments that were made that I think there's more pressing priorities that could be taken up. Thank you.
Thank you, Galen. Asha. Asha, you may be on mute. Oh, there you go.
Thank you for the presentation, Kai. On this question, I feel in principle, the standard should be similar with the main ISA. So like in ISA 600, component auditors, I feel that they should be included. Thank you.
Thank you, Asha. Let's see. Galen, your hand. Okay, you're fine. All right, Kai. So I have one more, looks like one more comment, and then I'll turn it back to you, Paul.
Yeah, I hope you can hear me, James, and thanks for letting me have a second bite of the cherry. I just wanted to circle back on the comment from the IOSCO representative. He made some very good points, but he did say that there seems to be a very strong pressure from Europe for this standard, and that is true. I would accept that, and I think you've heard from the various speakers today from Europe who are very supportive of this standard. However, what I would like to stress is that in the Paris conference, there were representatives from the donor agencies, including the World Bank, and they were very supportive of this project. And they were very supportive of moving this project along very quickly because they felt that it would greatly improve the quality of financial reporting in emerging and transitional markets. And that for me is a major selling point of this particular standard. It's not necessarily a solution for advanced economies in the European Union, but rather this is a solution that could be useful right across the world. Thanks for that, James.
Thank you, Paul. And I guess that was echoed by Daniel. All right, Kai.
Start by thanking you all for your good input in this area. Also, picking up on what Paul said, we did get great support not only from Europe but other jurisdictions and especially emerging markets, as you said. And I think one of the other things we need to remember with this project that it is an alternative to the ISAs. So the jurisdictions can decide whether to adopt or not, and there might be jurisdictions that decide not to because they don't need that standard. They may be covered already. There may not be that many audits being performed of less complex entities or less complex groups. I think also with the standard, if it includes less complex groups, jurisdictions may also decide on their own not to have group audits included in their version, and they could alter the standard by not having that part in their jurisdictions. They can have additional restrictions on use. So for jurisdictions, whether audits of less complex groups may not exist or they don't want that in the standard, they can exclude that also. I think, as we heard on this call, there are different views on whether to include component auditors or not. It's been one, as I said, one we've been struggling ourselves, and we will have a discussion with the board in the coming meeting. But we, on balance, think what we've seen so far is that when you go through the limitations and prohibitions and the qualitative characteristics, you're left with a relatively small group of entities or group audits, and for most of those, on balance, so far we're not thinking that component auditors are that big of a deal for them, but we will look into it more, and that's one question that we're, as I said, bringing to the board for discussion for this meeting. Again, thanks for the input and support, and also challenges. As I said, it's the challenges that also brings us to the best result at the end. So thank you for those. And I'll bring it back to you, Jim.
Thank you. I think you have one more slide there on your way forward. So
yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah. The last slide. As I said, we have now a discussion at the September meeting. We have not brought back all the detailed responses to the ED. We will continue to analyze and bring those back to the board at later meetings. And we're focusing on some of the priority areas. And as Hilde brought up, whether we could simplify or alter the approach to be more direct or different from the ISAs, that is one area we're also bringing back to the board for discussion this meeting, to be more proportionate and more less granular in the requirements than what we currently have in the draft and in the ISAs, whether we could have a more different approach to some of that. On the group audits, as I said, this is the first time we're bringing it to the board. Intention is to bring it back second time in December, and then we will have a public exposure separately on the group audit financial statements, so that it will not delay the work on the main standard itself.
Great. Kai, thank you for your presentation. I hope this feedback was helpful as you go into your discussion at the upcoming IAASB meeting, and we will continue to follow this one. Okay, we are going to continue on, and our next topic is audit evidence. And we are really close, or I would say the IAASB is really close on this audit evidence standard. We've talked about it a number of times in the CAG, and I think it's good. Well, I know it's going to be up for vote here in the September meetings. So I will turn it over to Sue for some, I don't want to say final perspectives, but Sue, some perspectives as we get this one over the hill. Sue, welcome.
Thanks very much, and hello everybody. Yeah, as you said, James, we're hopefully looking for approval of the ED at the next meeting. So we have a lot going on. When I spoke to you in March, we were just about to present the first full draft of ISA 500 revised to the IAASB, and we discussed it with you. Since then, we have considered changes to the draft that we presented to you based on the feedback from yourselves and from the IAASB. And we presented a second full draft version to the board at the June meeting. And we also were able to present some turnaround sections of some of the requirements in the application material to the board in June. And as you can see from the June meeting highlights on the IAASB website, the board was broadly supportive of the revisions that we presented in the turnaround document, and that's really important for us as we go into the September meeting, because it means we've been able to lock down the objective and the core requirements in the standard as we progress towards the approval. So in the last quarter, we've been focused really on enhancing the clarity of the material we have, and particularly in relation to the application material, updating from June. And so what you'll see in the changes document is that the changes from the June papers are not substantial. The version that you have, or some of the material I'll be talking about, is changes since March, because that's the last time we spoke. But the work we did in June, I think, has put us in a good position, hopefully, for next week. At the end of the presentation, there are 2 questions for yourselves, but obviously we'd appreciate any feedback as we consider the finalisation of the exposure draft. Next slide, please. The timeline, is worth highlighting, has changed since the last discussion that we had with the CAG. Although the approval of the exposure draft remains the same as being September, the finalisation date for the standard has moved from Q1 to Q2, and that's explained in the board papers. Really, the IAASB resources and the extended exposure period are really responsible for the change, but the changes are not expected to affect the effective date of the standard at this stage. Next slide, please. Just briefly recapping on the public interest issues that we've included in the project proposal, because they drive some of the activities that we have, well, obviously they drive the activities we've done, but looking at the changes in the information that auditors are using, including the nature and the source of the information, modernising in a principles-based way to reflect the evolution in technology, and fostering professional scepticism when making judgments. So they've been driving the project. Next slide, please. So digging into a little bit of the progress that we've made since March, when we last spoke to you, we've responded to the feedback from the IAASB in both March and June, and from yourselves in March, to address these public interest issues, including the matters highlighted on the slide. So clarifying the auditor's responsibilities relating to audit evidence when designing and performing audit procedures, and the interrelationship with the other standards. I'll pick that up in a minute, but it was in one of the versions that we had, it was talking about requirements in the ISAs, but we recognise that not all ISAs have specific requirements addressing design and performance of audit procedures. So it was important to embed the overarching principle as a requirement in ISA 500, and so that's there in various sections. We have clarified that designing and performing audit procedures in an unbiased manner applies to all audit procedures. There was a concern expressed in June that the requirement could be interpreted as just referring to further audit procedures in accordance with 330, but it includes risk assessment procedures in accordance 315 and other audit procedures that are performed in accordance with other ISAs. We added a separate requirement focusing on obtaining audit evidence about accuracy and completeness of information. This will crop up a little bit later in the presentation as well. But when we've been discussing the development of the requirements in paragraph 9 of your agenda item C2 on evaluating relevance and reliability, we've had to do a kind of balancing act here, because the intention is about developing a principles-based requirement that is capable of demonstrating the varying degree of work effort needed in the particular circumstances, i.e. that it's a scalable requirement. And so when we've been looking at consideration of accuracy and completeness within the overarching requirement, that actually then undermines the objective of a principles-based requirement to evaluate information based on the circumstances. So we have proposed a separate and conditional requirement to address the attributes of accuracy and completeness as applicable in the circumstance. And on balance, the board have supported that separate requirement. I think that also reflects some of the concerns that have been raised by regulators in this particular area and those attributes. We have also clarified the standback and the link to the overall conclusion about whether sufficient appropriate audit evidence has been obtained. And that is based on the application material that's included in ISA 330, which is looking at factors that influence the auditor's judgment about what is sufficient appropriate audit evidence. And then finally on this slide, we've continued the coordination with IAASB and the other working groups or consultation groups and task forces within the IAASB. And I think specifically to call out, the technology consultation group has helped us with providing enhanced and clarified guidance to address the appropriateness and reasonability of our inputs and algorithms when using technology, specifically things like artificial intelligence. And in July 2022, the IAASB staff performed a follow-up review of their review of proposed ISA 500, and they have notified the staff that their recommendations they consider are satisfactorily addressed. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to walk us through a couple of the sections within ISA 500 and some of the changes that you'll see since the March discussion. Firstly, in relation to purpose and scope, we have clarified the role of 500 in relation to the auditor's responsibilities to design and perform audit procedures. As I mentioned earlier, there was a concern about the wording that we've used, so we have clarified the terminology, and hopefully you'll be able to see that in the revised draft. We have reinforced the auditor's overall responsibilities in accordance with ISA 200 to exercise professional judgment and maintain skepticism throughout the audit. We have made some updates to paragraph 4, which is in the introductory section, to better align with the wording in ISA 200 in relation to the auditor's responsibility to exercise both professional skepticism and professional judgment. You will see we now have a two-part objective, which deals with firstly the auditor's responsibility to design and perform audit procedures, and also the evaluation of information intended to be used as audit evidence. The draft that you saw previously just had the evaluation piece in it. And while the board were very supportive of that concept, they also recommended that we include the responsibility to design and perform audit procedures for the purpose of obtaining sufficient appropriate audit evidence. So that you will see in the revised standard. Next slide, please. So moving on to persuasiveness and sufficient appropriate audit evidence. Some of the changes since March here are clarifying the definition of audit evidence to reflect that it's information that the auditor uses in drawing conclusions. The reason for that is that we noted that as the auditor performs audit procedures, there may be information that is unreliable or outdated and therefore isn't used to draw conclusions as the basis for audit report for the audit report. So that has been reflected in the drafting. We have relocated and streamlined a lot of the guidance in the application material about the concept of sufficient appropriate audit evidence and the interrelationship of the sufficiency, appropriateness and persuasiveness of audit evidence. We had a number of offline comments from the board in March around some of the structure and the fact that the material that we had was useful at various stages of the standard rather than it had just been tied to one particular part. So what you will see there is some reordering and some streamlining of the material, which hopefully we feel makes flow better. And that was the feedback we got from the board in June, actually. We have clarified the concept in extant ISA 500 that management's unwillingness to respond to an inquiry or request from the auditor is a scope limitation. There was some wording that we had previously where we used that refusal to provide information as an example, but the board was keen to make sure that we highlighted the fact that in that situation there is also a scope limitation, so we have reflected that. And then finally, we've enhanced the application material on the attribute of authenticity. Authenticity is an example of an attribute of reliability as set out in the papers that you have. And based on the board's request to provide more guidance on the concept of authenticity, we have included material that refers to the guidance in ISO 200 and 240 on authenticity, because obviously that link to fraud is important. Next slide, please. Moving on to relevance and reliability of information to be used as audit evidence, we have retained the principles-based requirement that applies to all sources of information. So this is consistent with the project objectives, which talked about a principles-based approach. And this is the area that I mentioned earlier, that we want to make sure that this is scalable and reflects the different circumstances that there may be. But we have also introduced a separate and conditional requirement to obtain audit evidence about accuracy and completeness of the information where applicable in the circumstances. So that's what I mentioned earlier. We have restructured the application material and enhanced the application material, including targeted guidance on the work effort when evaluating relevance and reliability. So as I mentioned earlier, there was some feedback around some of the structural pieces. And we have also added some clarifications that, for example, the work may be performed concurrently with audit procedures that are applied on the information, or it may be obtained from performing other audit procedures in accordance with the ISAs. And there are examples there to hopefully bring that to life. We have explained circumstances in which the auditor may determine that accuracy and completeness attributes are applicable in the circumstances. And that includes a reference to information generated internally from the entity's information system, which is consistent with the basis that we have at the moment for testing accuracy and completeness in extant 500. But we also have guidance that explains that, for example, information that's been obtained from a source external to the entity, the auditor may be more focused on other attributes of reliability, including, for example, the credibility of the source providing the information. We have clarified aspects relevant to the auditor's work effort when documenting the consideration of attributes of relevance and reliability. This was a question that came up in the CAG meeting in March, and we highlighted that there. I think that the project proposal excluded aspects of documentation in relation to 230, but we have provided guidance on some of the links and the references to 230 in the application material to build that link a little bit stronger. Next slide, please. Technology was one of the big objectives, and some of the changes since March have been revised and streamlined application material on automation bias when using automated tools and techniques. I think both the board and there were some comments at the last CAG meeting were that the drafting we had in March felt a little bit negative, and we were asked for a more balanced approach to reflect perhaps some of the expected benefits, including efficiency when using technology in certain circumstances. So we have revised the application material in that respect. And we have enhanced and clarified guidance to address the appropriateness and reasonableness of inputs and algorithms when using technology such as artificial intelligence, which, as I mentioned earlier, was a response to the suggestions we had in the CAG meeting and the board, but also retaining that principle-based approach, which is intended to be technology neutral. So we've had to be very careful in drafting the application material that we keep that technology neutral piece, and that we are not referring to specific types of technology such as blockchain or artificial intelligence, which may become redundant or outdated over the life of the standard. Next slide, please. Professional skepticism is the last piece, and the proposals since March to reinforce professional skepticism have been around clarifying the requirements, design and perform audit procedures in a manner that isn't biased, by including application material that explains that the requirement applies to all audit procedures, including risk assessment procedures and other audit procedures, as I've previously mentioned. and explaining what designing and performing audit procedures in an unbiased manner may involve. So there's new application material there. We have clarified the requirements about where there are doubts about relevance and reliability of information, and there's guidance there focusing on the auditor's actions to resolve the doubts, recognising that there may be different ways to resolve the doubts. So that's in the application material. And we have clarified the proposed standback requirement to evaluate the audit evidence obtained. As I mentioned previously, the scope and the level of the standback has been linked to the material in the requirements of ISA 330. And it looks at whether the audit evidence obtained meets the intended purpose of the audit procedures performed for relevant assertions for significant classes of transactions, account balances and disclosures. So that is linked to the relevant guidance in ISA 330. Next slide, please. So that's a kind of whistle-stop tour of what we've done since I spoke to you in March. As I say, a number of changes were presented to the board and then refined again in June. So you have the material in front of you. We will be asking for the board's approval, and we're looking for your views on the draft that will be presented to the board for approval, and whether there are any other matters that you would like us to consider as we finalise the exposure draft. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Sue. I think this is very important that we have, this is really our final chance as a CAG to provide feedback on the audit evidence standard. So I very much would like to hear from you on that. And so please, this is your chance. Christian.
Yes, thank you very much, Chairman. And so thank you for the presentation. And from an Accounting Europe perspective, we want to express our overall support to the standard and want to congratulate really to this achievement. So that's fantastic. We do have 2 points we would like to address. One is we have noted that the evolution in technology has been considered. We do understand that it is due to the principle-based approach mainly now embedded in the application guidance. And we also appreciate that it is foreseen that we also see non-authoritative guidance bringing out additional information. So this is something we really urge you to continue the path, because we deem this that it needs to be addressed. That's just as a feedback. One point was that Accounts Europe also asked to strengthen the link between this standard and the fraud standard, because we do see some connections which should be addressed. Just to give you an example, we are facing a lot of short-selling attacks in Europe, where the companies are being attacked also with negative press. And if you're the auditor of such a company, the question often comes up, how do I deal with this evidence, this information? So we're talking about evidence that might give an indication on to fraud. But what we see is, where are the boundaries with respect to the auditors? What should they consider? What can they consider? What shouldn't they consider? Especially because of the different levels of reliability of such information, because it may be also purpose driven. So that is it from our side. So thank you very much for the presentation.
Thank you, Christian. Paul.
Yeah, I think actually to a great extent echoing Christian's comments. The technology section was the part that I paid particular attention to, and I do think the work group did a really good job of making the automated audit techniques more balanced. I applaud you for that, and I also think just the kind of the way that the inputs and algorithms is positioned is better than it had been in the past. I think it does allow for evolution of technology. And again, as Christian said, really appreciate that it's very principle-based. I absolutely think when it comes to technology, you have to remain principle-based. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Yes, certainly the technology changes all the time.
On it.
Let's see.
Still.
Way.
Thank you. Hello, everyone.
thank you for the update. As a stock market regulator, I support this project to address some of key public interest comments. So I suppose that, and I also would like to point out, I suppose a linkage to ISA 200 to provide greater emphasis on professional skepticism and professional judgment, and guidance related to evaluating audit evidence when automation and technology are being used. I would also like to note one area that I appreciate the task force has done. In paragraph 13 of the draft, it is required to consider all evidence obtained when which may be inconsistent with other audit evidence or contradict the assertions in the financial statements. The emphasis is on considering all audit evidence obtained, and regardless of whether it appears to corroborate or contradicts the assertions in the financial statements. In my view, this requirement will change auditor behavior in concluding whether sufficient appropriate audit evidence has been obtained. I support to release the exposure draft. Thank you, that's all.
Thank you, Wei. Let's see. Akihito.
Thank you, James. Thank you very much for your clear presentation. I support the principle-based revision and direction concepts of the current exposure draft as a whole. I'd like to raise just one point as a suggestion. Regarding the reliability of information, this is a very important point, and relevant paragraph 49 looks good. For more enhancement and clarification, I think that it is useful to clarify that even if the source of information is external, the risk of manipulation by management needs to be considered carefully in cases, especially considering remote audit. In the environment where remote audits are being carried out as technology evolves, I believe that it is important to explicitly include the word manipulation by management. It's my suggestion. Other than that, I have two brief comments. Firstly, it is very good to hear to collaborate other groups, including IAASB's technology group. It should be continued, and clarification of each role and timely information sharing are very crucial, and it should continue to be kept in mind. Secondly, as Christian mentioned, it is important to develop guidance regarding technology in a timely manner to keep pace with rapid advances in technology, considering scalability and proportionality. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Akihito. Hussein.
Thank you. Thank you for presentation. I am also supportive for this project. I see lots of enhancements, both main part and application part. As audit, most of the audit evidence obtained from audit procedure, I think it should be useful to reconsider to put audit procedure in main part of draft, exposure draft, and in application part for audit procedure, it should be useful to make more example, more implementation example. It's make it better. I think putting a type of audit procedure in application guidance, application part, it makes the importance of audit procedure. Therefore, I think task force should reconsider to, as I know, at the beginning of this, I think first version of ISA 500, in the main part, audit procedure describe, and but for this version, type of audit procedure just put into the appendix. Thank you.
Thank you, Hussein. Conchita.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate very much the journey taken to reach this point where, so to speak, it will be for the approval of the IAASB. And overall, I support the draft. Just to join the others on the comments on technology, the dimension of technology, because it is constantly evolving, and I am not confident that the way audit is being done, and so with assurance processes, that they are in keeping with the challenges of what technology has impacted on business transactions. Thank you.
Thank you. Quite a few comments on the technology side. Galen.
Yes, I'd like to express appreciation for the presentation. It's very excellent. And I do support this going forward. Just a couple queries though. On slide 6, I did like the notion of clarifying the concept in the standard of it when management has an unwillingness to respond to inquiries regarding that as a scope limitation. I wonder whether the task force thought of whether there's an opportunity to link. Would this also be considered a no-clar to cut the question short? And if so, if it's an indication of no-clar, would there be a link perhaps to ISA 250? I looked in there and I didn't see anything directly mentioning scope limitation, but I just raised that question. And then on the technology end of it, I've been reading a lot about digital assets recently and evidence of ownership and so forth. And we are in a different world. I know that's going to change over time, as has been brought up, but the whole idea of private and public passwords, evidence of ownership and so forth, I hope there's going to be some application guidance or not, maybe even non-authoritative information on that, because I've been reading about these cyber currency lending and what happens when somebody loses the password or changes it. I think it's a huge issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Galen. Let's see if we have anyone else. Okay, Sue, I'll give you a chance to respond.
Thanks. I could see a couple more hands up on my screen, Jim. I don't know whether you I can see Asha and Greg.
Let me scan up. Maybe, oh, yes, you are correct. Asha, sorry, somehow you got buried in my screen.
Okay, that's good. Thank you for the presentation, Sue. Just wanted to show my support on the amendments that you have brought into the standard. I feel the requirements in the standard are more in detail and clear and has given clear instructions to the auditor. Also, I'm fully agreeing on bringing the unbiasedness aspect as part of the requirements rather than in the application guidance. I just want to mention that I noted a similarity between ISA 540 on unbiasedness of evidence obtained from relating to management assumptions, ISA 540 on auditing on accounting estimates. That was very useful for us as audit regulators. Most auditors we have noted that look for evidence for two things, like either to support their own predetermined stand or to substantiate management's assumptions or their explanation. So I also feel that obtaining unbiased evidence will lead to obtaining evidence from different sources, so which in turn will be helpful for helpful in obtaining sufficient appropriate audit evidence, which is the main objective of this standard. So bringing in this provision is a good move. Thank you. One more thing, I was just wondering whether the changes made, particularly relating to automation and technology, will have an impact on ISA 501, special consideration on audit evidence. I'm sure that you all would have looked at it, just a small concern. Thank you.
Thank you, Asha. Greg.
Thank you. Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Sue. Just to express support, given the status of the project, looking forward to the exposure draft and the standard coming into effect. I think it'll be very timely, relevant, helpful. And just to respond to the other question with respect to any additional matters, there's no additional matters from a public sector perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. And I think if I've done this correctly, I have no other hands up. Sue, I'll just add one other comment for me. If there's any additional perspective you can give on the stand back provision, that would be helpful as well. And I'll turn it back to you for responding to the feedback. I think you're on mute, Sue.
Sorry. Thanks. So let me just take this. I think one of the things that's come through loud and clear is on technology. And I think actually what some of your comments illustrated is the kind of balance we've been trying to achieve here, because a lot of the examples that were quoted are things that are current and obviously very relevant. But there will be other examples in a year, 2 years, 3 years time. So the reference to non-authoritative guidance, I apologise, I should have referenced that earlier in any event, because it is seen as an important part of the exercise. And the IAASB has its technology working group as well, looking at some of those and can provide more insight as well. A couple of the comments in relation to technology also were quite good illustrations of the discussions we've been having around the relevant attributes of relevance and reliability, because in some of these cases, you need the consideration of things like the reputation, the credibility of where the information is coming, and that's maybe more of a focus in terms of looking at that. I was just going to pick up a couple of the comments, Jim, if that's okay. There was Christian, you made the comment around 240 as well, and I think Akihito also referenced coordination with the fraud task force. You'll appreciate that the fraud work is at a slightly earlier stage, but we have been doing quite a lot of work with that group. And actually what you will see in 240 is a reflection of some of the work that we've done on 500. So in some ways, 500 isn't necessarily the right place to address it, but 240 might be. And clearly we will continue that coordination, because it is so important. Akihito, you referenced manipulation by management. We have something in there when we're talking about use of a management expert, but we will take that back and take a look at the wording that we have. Hussein, I think you referenced the piece about types of audit procedures in the appendix previously. The board has considered that. So I think that will probably be something to get feedback on during the consultation period. Galen, you referenced the no-CLAR point on no response from management. That's something that we will take a look at. I'm just looking at the rest of my notes. I think I'll come back to the stand back in a second, Jim, but there was a question actually on the chat about how this would improve the quality of audits. And I'm actually working on the presentation for the board at the moment, and we do have a slide there which talks about how this will impact quality of audits. And I think what we've got is not sort of like one huge change, but what we've got is a basket of things that are incremental. And I think one of the speakers referenced, the point about all audit evidence will, consideration of all audit evidence will improve quality. I think those kind of things, they come together as a collection. So there will be more material that you can see and that we will be looking at for the explanatory memorandum, I think. On the stand back, Jim, I wasn't quite sure exactly what you were looking for. I think it's really linking it to the overall conclusion in 330 about whether sufficient appropriate audit evidence has been obtained, and it also picks up that point about considering all audit evidence. So it's really that piece about moving from individual pieces of audit evidence, if you like, to that kind of overall assessment at the at the conclusion stage. There was a question about 500 and the other 500 standards. We'll have a question, or that we expect that there'll be feedback on the ED that will help inform any activities on those standards. So I think that's probably it. If anybody feels I've missed anything or anything, just give me a shout. And sorry, and I should have also said thank you. I really appreciate all the support, because it's easy to work through the list of things to respond to, but overall, very appreciative of the support and the kind comments. So we'll keep our fingers crossed for next week.
Thank you, Sue. Hopefully this was a good discussion prior to your meeting next week, and we thank you for coming to visit the CAG and presenting on this to give us some final chances to comment. And with that, we will go into our break. Our break is going to be until 8:40 Eastern Standard Time. So you have about 8 minutes, and I'll see everyone in about 8 minutes. Thank you. I'd like to welcome everyone back as we continue from our break. And Josephine, before we kick it off with you and going concern, I did want to just jump back for 1 minute here. And let me see. We get everyone back here. Dave Sullivan, I didn't call on you for any perspectives on the first few presentations, but I will see if you have any from a PIOB perspective, or otherwise we will continue on and hear from Josephine.
Jim, thanks very much. I have a couple of thoughts on the two presentations that we've had, and want to thank Kai and Sue for those. They were really helpful. On the LCE project, we're very supportive of that project and believe that it will drive consistency in the execution of audits for a large segment of the population, certainly in some jurisdictions, as we heard. So we think that it's an important project. There may be a need to address that this is not some lesser form of assurance that's being provided, but rather it's a scaling of the ISAs to address a certain segment of the marketplace, whether that's in the standard or in the auditor's report, that might be considered. I do think that the scope of the standard is really important, because I believe there will be a natural tendency to want to apply this standard to a broader set of clients, and it should be limited to those clients that are relevant. There was a lot of discussion on the group audit, and certainly in some jurisdictions, for tax or regulatory reasons, there may be multiple entities that comprise a group audit, some of which use component auditors. I don't think that should be seen as a way to take this to larger or more complex entities, but just recognize the reality in those situations. I do think and I think the task force is doing a good job on this, a less complex entity is based on the characteristics of that entity, and not on the capabilities of necessarily the capabilities it can be, but not necessarily the capabilities of management or the auditor. And what I mean by that is, if you've got an entity with very complex estimates, but the entity or the auditor has a lot of experience, that does not mean the entity is less complex. It just means they've addressed those complexities appropriately. The task force might consider addressing situations where an LCE is not auditable. And by saying that, there may be a lack of records or controls or other matters that deem an entity not to be auditable, and that auditors shouldn't assume that every entity is auditable. Let's see, I have another comment here. I have to see if I can read it. No, I don't need to mention that. So that's it on LCEs. On audit evidence, this again, I think is an important project and kind of a foundational one. And Sue, I really appreciate the work that the task force has done and the improvements that you've made since the last time we looked at this. I think you've made some significant changes that are very helpful. Very supportive of the clarification of the auditor's role in evaluating the relevance and reliability of audit evidence, clearly in light of more recent frauds like Wirecard. That's incredibly important. We support encouraging auditors to use as appropriate external evidence, both supporting and contradictory evidence, and evaluating that for relevance and reliability, but also how that might impact the auditor's conclusions. I appreciate the focus that you have on skepticism and professional judgment, which is really important here. I think the stand back test is very important, sort of at the end of the audit, taking a deep breath and looking at the audit evidence and evaluating the sufficiency of audit evidence is really important. And how you describe that in the application materials will be key. And then finally, this comment, maybe this is beyond the scope of the audit evidence standard, but I'm going to mention it anyway. With respect to internal controls, is there some minimum amount of work of evidence the auditor should obtain with respect to internal controls in any audit, and how might that impact the extent of substantive testing that may be done? As I say, that may be beyond the scope of the standard, but I think it's an important point for auditors to consider. So with that, Jim, those are the thoughts that I had. Happy to take any questions or just move on if you'd like.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you for sharing those perspectives from PIOB. I think we're going to move now to Josephine, and Josephine, I'll give you the floor for your going concern task force.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you for the introduction, and of course always the opportunity to attend the CAG session. Team really do appreciate the CAG taking time out of their schedules and inputting to the work of the board. I would like to take the chance, if I can, to remind the CAG members of the staff and task force assigned to this project, because without them, there would be nothing here to present to you. So we have Sally Ann and Kalina keeping the task force organised and focused and working very hard in the background. And of course, to Willie for providing us with his excellent support. And the going concern task force includes Ado, who I believe is going to join us today as well. So we might hear from Ado, and we have Wendy and Isabel. So if we move to the next slide, please, the agenda items that you have to look through at the moment are agenda item D, which of course is the cover and the report back. And then we have this presentation as well. And then for reference, we've included copies of the papers that go to the IAASB September meeting, which of course include the issues paper, the drafting paragraphs, and of course mapping of the actions to the project proposal. So on the agenda today, I'm going to give you an update on developments. So we'll summarize what we discussed at the June board meeting and other updates there. And then I'll focus on the more recent proposals being presented next week. And those are primarily focused on the risk assessment procedures and procedures over management's assessment of going concern. I'll also cover professional skepticism and terminology, two other areas we focused on for September. And then I'll pop back and cover the timeline and transparency matters and the release of the non-authoritative guidance, which we actually discussed with the board at the June 2022 board meeting. Just generally sort of standing back from all of this, our favorite phrase these days, standing back. Obviously, the CAG were party to the project proposal and that process of finalising the project proposal. So none of this should be a surprise to you at all in terms of the actions that we're actually pursuing here. But anyway, next slide, please. So very, very briefly on this one, this slide is basically summarizing those key parts of the project proposal that the going concern task force focused on at the June board meeting. And as you can see from the bullets, those actions were really addressing the transparency piece, so communication with those charged with governance, with users of the report, and of course with appropriate external parties, which is mainly, of course, primarily thinking about those in authoritative positions such as regulators. And then, of course, we also looked at the proposed change in the commencement date of the period of the auditor's evaluation. But because I'm going to cover these a little bit later, I'm not going to focus too much on this slide. So if we could move to the next one, please. I think it's Michelle who's moving them. Thank you, Michelle. So CAG is obviously already aware of our regular interaction with the IAASB and in particular on the matter of going concern. And hopefully most are now aware of the fact the IAASB, of course, decided not to add a project on going concern in its future work plan, but we did feel it would be helpful to ensure we continue to engage with them on this topic. So Tom did send a letter to the IAASB in that vein, and we have of course had follow-up conversations with them. So essentially, we will continue to keep them apprised of our work and keep that dialogue open. And staff, I have been in conversation with staff at IAASB. And we understand that they are pursuing a project to revise IPSAS 1, which we should see coming through around 2023. And that would include, of course, looking at the going concern requirements in that standard as well. So that covers our update so far, and we can move on to the next slide, please. So this area, as I mentioned earlier, is what we're focusing on for our September board discussions. So risk assessment procedures and related activities. Now, the project proposal highlighted the issue that a stronger link between ISA 315 was needed in ISA 570 to support a more robust work effort regarding going concern, and of course a more timely identification of matters related to going concern. And in the issues paper, if you had a chance to have a look at that, there is a diagram at the top of page 4 of that issues paper, which is attempting to illustrate this key point that there are always going to be those events and conditions. Those are what we understand in 315 as those that drive our inherent risks and our fraud risk factors. And so understanding those events and conditions, of course, filters through very much to the auditor's going concern work. And ultimately in ISA 570, we're focused on really understanding whether any of those events and conditions cast significant doubt. So it's very much an important factor to bring those standards together. So the task force approach to this was very similar to that in what we've been doing in the fraud project. And of course, more recently, you'll be familiar with how we approached ISA 600 and ISA 540. And that's to better align the structure and flow of ISA 570 with that of ISA 315. So in the drafting paragraphs, there's some rejigging and a bit of geography going on there to make sure that things are aligned. And and we've also, of course, strengthened the requirements and application material for an approach that should deliver a much more robust identification of events and conditions and a more timely understanding of management's approach to going concern matters. Now, just sort of for levity or perhaps clarity, for the purpose of this presentation to you today, I may shorten phrases. In some cases, some of those phrases are quite a mouthful. So I won't always use the strict technical language, but hopefully we still have all the correct strict technical language in our standard and all the correct phraseology. So bear with me from that perspective. So anyway, as with other projects, we try to focus on as well on those aspects of 315 that are specifically related to going concern matters, and tried really hard not to just simply repeat what's required in ISA 315 or repeat the language. But in certain places we felt, particularly in the application material, it is important to tease some of that out a little bit more and take some of those examples that we see in 315, like for example, business risks, and just tease them out and demonstrate how those business risks could therefore give you an indicator that you've got events and conditions that cast doubt. And I do believe, to Barb's point that she made at the March CAG meeting, we have made sure we've highlighted in the application material that the auditors work under ISA 570, whilst it should be integrated with their work in 315, it still might be the case they need to adjust their risk assessment when information comes to light. And in addition, we've also added material that highlights that it's possible that the auditors work under ISA 570 may demonstrate fraud risk factors are present, which might not have been previously identified. So we're pulling all those strands together as best we can. So next slide, please. So here we have management's assessment. So this was another area or issue we agreed to address, and that's the need for a lot more robust evaluation of management's assessment of going concern. And in particular, we were called to draw from the concepts in ISA 540 in order to focus on a better understanding and of course evaluation of management's use of method, assumptions and data. So you'll see from agenda D3, so the drafting paragraph, that the auditors valuation, someone chatting there? Someone else? No. You'll see that the auditor's evaluation now includes the evaluation of those methods, assumptions and data used in the context, of course, of obtaining evidence in order to conclude on the use of the going concern basis of accounting and determine if there's any material uncertainties. Now, scalability is really important here. And so we have added application material to explain that in some situations, management's method, assumptions and data may well be very straightforward and may be very basic. And if that's acceptable, given the nature and circumstances of the entity, then equally the auditor's evaluation should be straightforward. But certainly in a more complex scenario, the auditor's work effort here would be a lot greater. So of course, there's a lot more detail in the AM than in the application material than I'm giving it benefit at the moment. But there are various different points in the standard where we have focused on those scalability paragraphs. Now, the other change that we've made, which is highlighted in the first bullet, is to recognise that management's assessment is based on assumptions and judgments, including assumptions and judgments as to whether those events and conditions they've identified actually cast doubt. And so therefore, the auditor's evaluation of that assessment should have the same starting point. And that's to make sure, as I mentioned earlier, that they're really much more robustly reviewing management's judgments and assumptions related to going concern. So that's a slight change from the extant standard. Okay, so if we pop to the next slide, please. So you will recall from the project proposal that we did, of course, need to improve the focus on professional skepticism when it comes to going concern. And I have mentioned a bit of this already, that we have drawn attention to the fact that the auditor's work on going concern may give rise to fraud risk factors that the auditor had not previously identified. And also, importantly, that there may well be bias in management's judgments when making their assessment. And so it's really important for the auditor to remain aware of that. So we've introduced language in the standard to highlight that particular point. And also we've enhanced the requirements and application material to take account, as I mentioned earlier, of making sure that the evidence obtained is not obtained in a manner that's biased as well. So if we could move to the next slide. Okay, so in terms of terminology, we have now developed a definition of material uncertainty, but we have based this on the existing description in extant ISA 570. So it remains consistent with the extant standard, and it remains relevant to the auditor's decisions and conclusions. But to clarify a little bit further, we have included application material that helps the auditor think about those factors, I guess, that might be relevant to management's judgments when they're identifying whether there are uncertainties. And those are primarily focused on the likelihood of the events or conditions occurring and the magnitude should they actually occur. And that's primarily what we focus on. And that was primarily in response to stakeholder comments that they really felt they needed a strong definition to tie those conclusions to that the auditor has to make as they go through their process and work through management's assessment of going concern. So, and that's what I want to say on that slide. So next slide, please. Okay, so now we're addressing those matters that we discussed with the board at the June meeting. So in terms of the timeline, the task force proposed and the board agreed that the period of at least 12 months should remain unchanged. And when we had a discussion with CAG about this in the project proposal, that was very much a CAG caution that we shouldn't change that 12 months period when we're looking to revise or making the standard more robust. But recognizing that the commencement date is in fact different across certain accounting standards and that a number of jurisdictions have changed the commencement date to the date of approval of the financial statements, it was considered responsive to stakeholder feedback that the commencement date of the period of assessment should be changed in ISA 570 also. Now, our stakeholders also encourage the board to enhance requirements to evaluate the reasonableness of the actual period that management has chosen to make their assessment. And that, of course, as I mentioned earlier, is in the context of the conditions specific to the entity's facts and circumstances. The board agree with the task force proposals, but the task force has made some subsequent changes since June to the requirements in response to the board comments, particularly in relation to the ordering of the requirements, so logical steps, if you like, when having these discussions with management and going through the auditor's work. And then if we can move on to the next slide, and I'll be fairly brief with these two topics. Essentially, in proceeding with the proposed actions in the project proposal, we have actually elevated the brief reference to communications with regulatory authorities in the extent standard and developed more robust requirements in that regard. But it is focused on whether one needs to report to an appropriate authority when a material uncertainties paragraph or modified opinion is issued. And then in terms of communications with those charged with governance, including CAG, were obviously very supportive of us enhancing the requirements here. So we have enhanced the requirements related to communications. And of course, we've also enhanced the application material to explain why those communications were important. And this is an area that was lacking in the extant standard. So we've made that slightly more, I was going to say visible, but we've explained it a little bit better and also given an example as well. If we could have the next slide, please. So transparency in the auditor's report. So this is about enhanced transparency around the auditor's work in relation to going concern. And we also presented this in June. And I also note that CAG's support of the project proposal in this area as well. So the main proposals for this area are summarized on this slide. So if we start, hopefully everyone can see, if we start with that main box in the top left corner. So this is where you have the no material uncertainty exists and the going concern basis of accounting is appropriate. See, they're mouthfuls, these words, mouthfuls. So the first piece is that the auditor is required under ISA 570 already, or they have an obligation under ISA 570 already to conclude that management's use of the going concern accounting is appropriate and no material uncertainties have been identified. So that obligation already exists today. But in this regard, it was felt by the task force and by our stakeholders that we should be much more transparent about the auditor's work and the auditor's obligation in this regard. And so therefore, in all cases, the auditors would make that statement in their report. So users of financial statements are aware of the auditor's position on this matter. But then if we move down a little bit, there may be situations where there are events and conditions that actually may cast doubt. And management has had to make some significant judgments in drawing their own conclusions that despite those events and conditions that cast doubt, no material uncertainty exists. Now, this is what we've been commonly banding around as a close call situation, but we have to recognise there may be a spectrum of that. But the task force felt that in that situation, and of course in response, as I say, to our stakeholder comments, that the auditors should describe their own work effort in that situation, and that's why we have that in the bottom box there. But proportionality, of course, is an important factor here, and the task force believe that it would be appropriate to differentiate this requirement to listed entities only. And this recognises that the information needs of the users of auditors' reports of entities can differ. So the distinction here being that those users or owners that have access to further information and insights to the auditor's work, and of course those that do not, and users of listed entities generally do not have that direct access to auditor communications with management about their work. So in that regard, we felt that this was much more appropriate for that listed entity market rather than all entities across all stages. So moving across to the bottom right, to address the concern raised by stakeholders that there can be more information in the auditor's report in a close call situation than in a material uncertainty situation, and that will occur where such reporting in that previous box is already required, or where it's been reported under ISA 701. The task force have now introduced that same requirement. Again, it's differentiated for listed entities for the same reason, and in this situation then the auditor describes the auditor's work effort when there's a material uncertainty, but management's use of the going concern basis of accounting is appropriate. Also, not on this slide, but worth mentioning, in response to comments about the lack of consistency in reporting, including certain navigation issues, the task force had proposed to the board that any going concern commentary in the auditor's report should follow the basis of opinion paragraph. So it's all sitting in the same place now. So auditors don't have to navigate through various sections of the auditor's report in order to access relevant commentary about going concern matters. They're not then, it's much easier for them to see the story in one place than try and pull the story together themselves. And actually, I believe it was Mr. Yoshi who mentioned at the last CAG that we had that the prominence of such disclosures should be raised. So hopefully tying everything together in one place should address his concern also. So if we move on to the next slide, please. Right, so you may recall from the project proposal that stakeholders, of course, cited confusion about the material uncertainty section in the auditor's report and its relationship with key audit matters and emphasis of matter paragraphs, where there are going concern issues, including with respect to close calls. So the task force are, of course, addressing this in the revisions that we've just discussed. But given this will take a little bit of time to creep through to the approval process, it was felt important to be agile and develop something more timely. And so we've developed non-authoritative guidance to help address some of this confusion. And the guidance, of course, explains the differences between the different requirements and, of course, the interactions between them as well. So we issued that in August 2022, so not that long ago, but hopefully you will get a chance to have a look through that unless you had already downloaded it and taken it on your summer holidays and looked through it already. So by all means, do send us some feedback if you have any thoughts on that. So if we move on to the next slide, we're at the next steps now. So we have a few other actions, of course, that you'll know from the project proposal we need to address. We have to think about the use of technology and sources of information, as well as thinking about other aspects of terminology. We have to look at any conforming and consequential amendments to other relevant ISAs. And we will be discussing that with the board at the December board meeting. And of course, we'll be revising the proposals as we go along in response to board comments. We will, of course, continue to liaise with others, and hopefully by March 2023, we should be in a really good shape to approve an exposure draft. So if we can move to the next slide, nearly there. So Jim, I would like to hand back to you to invite CAG comments, but would like to say, and I take full responsibility for this, by all means, you don't need to focus just on those bullet points. I probably should have suggested we take those out, and that's my fault entirely. So any of the proposals, generally happy to hear from the CAG. Thank you, Jim. Back to you.
Thank you, Josephine, and I agree. It would be good for any comments on this particular topic. I'm glad to see the increased rigor in terms of going concern. So, Barb, nice to see you.
Good morning, and thank you, Josephine. Maybe a comment and then maybe a question. Interested in how the auditor addresses management bias, right? Which may be unintentional, but maybe rather more of a hope or a wish about conditions and events. Consider whether at some point the auditor should seek external information. It may be different in different jurisdictions, right? But when management has a plan to overcome conditions and events, quite frequently, a lot of that information is coming specifically just internal to the company. Some of it, that may be the only source of that information. But if external information exists that would either support or refute management's assumptions or plans, I think that is a way of potentially addressing the natural bias that may come in some of these decisions. And then maybe when you have a chance, after you get through the questions, would be interested in your views on the reporting scenarios. So when no material uncertainty exists, I assume that within that bucket, there's a spectrum. And there's a spectrum where there are close calls, but there could be a number of companies that it was not a close call. And in those cases, I wonder what specifically you're hoping to see from auditors as to how they address conditions and events. Because I assume that there may be more of a need to address conditions and events when it's a close call than when it's not a close call at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Barb. And since you started speaking, my screen has lit up. So I will start from the top. Klaus?
Yeah, thank you. I have a couple of comments on the timeline and the transparency issues here. First of all, I think it's an interesting project, of course, and it's important to get this going. But first, on the timeline, on the moving to the commencement date here, I wonder about the impact that might have on the reporting process and also on the auditing process. Since if you go to the date of approval, I would assume that the auditor also needs to have audit evidence up until the date of approval in order to be able to assess the 12-month period going forward then. And my thought is, or my reflection is that this might actually slow down the auditing process or make it moving in another way, because if you pull everything to the date of approval, you have moved it very far from the end of the fiscal year. Recognizing that if you move to the date of approval, you will have more fresh information, of course, which is the big upside, of course, of doing this compared if you have in the end of the fiscal year. But I think there's some balance. I think there is a need to think about this, how this might impact the process going forward, also from the audit client perspective and from the auditor perspective. So it's a reflection. Regarding transparency, my thinking about this is that I would assume that everything that an auditor writes in its report must be mirrored in some way or another, also what the audit client writes in the annual accounts and in its financial reports. And the thing is here that I would assume that one key issue for the auditor that has not been reflected in this presentation today is that I would assume that it's difficult for an auditor to come up with any new information that is not reflected by what the audit client has written or reported on. So that makes it it's very important to what degree can an enhanced reporting and transparency requirement really help in that sense. Isn't there a risk? I would think that it turns into a boilerplate report from the auditor in the end, even though the good intent is to say to be as entity specific as possible on this side. So I think that's also another reflection I would like to bring to the table. Thanks.
Thank you, Klaus. Akihito.
Thank you, James. Thank you very much, Josephine, for your great presentation. Let me share 3 points. Firstly, it is very important to keep consistent between international auditing standard and international accounting standard in order to avoid confusing in the accounting and auditing practice. So to continue to engage dialogue and consider the constructive action with IAASB is crucial, I believe. The second point is regarding the timeline. I think that only if auditors do not judge that management evaluation period is reasonable, the extension of the management evaluation period should be requested to management. Such change in the order of the process in provisions makes sense and is useful, practical in accounting and auditing practice, I think. Lastly, regarding transparency in auditor's report, I think that it may be considered to reward in terms of whether the statement no material uncertainties relating to events or conditions have been identified. In page 11 in this presentation slide, may be interpreted as not providing the proposed reasonable assurance, but providing absolute assurance. My concern is misrecognition. That's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you for your points, Akihito. Wei.
Oh, thank you. Hello. Thanks a lot for the work has been done, and thanks a lot for the presentation. In my view, this project is an important topic to address public interest. I'm glad to see the task force has already drafted paragraphs for proposed revision. I support the proposal proposed to enhance transparency. From the perspective of investors, they want to learn enterprise-specific information and the going concern risks this particular enterprise faces. So I would like to echo what the previous CAG member mentioned. I would like to suggest to enhance effective disclosure in the auditor report and to avoid boilerplate disclosure. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Wei. Kazuhiro.
Thank you for detailed and to the point presentation. I have 4 comments. First, the time regarding the timeline. Since management formulated the management plan and strategies on a fiscal year basis, so I wonder how much meaning there is in setting the period for management to be assessed to be 12 months from the date of approval of the financial result rather than the closing date. If the business community opposes it, I doubt whether there are merits enough to persuade them. And second comment regarding the transparency. I agree with the provision regarding the audit report. And the provisions of A24, A25, and A25A are considered to be essential information disclosures for users of financial statements. I think it should be stipulated in the accounting standards or financial presentation regulation, but considering the jurisdictions where the accounting standards and rules don't fully correspond, I think it would be very meaningful to include those provisions, especially such as A25A in the auditing standards. And next, regarding the communication with those charged with governance, I agree with the content of enhancement of communication with those charged with governance. And I would like to make one small comment regarding the items that the auditor should understand stipulated in A6F on page 21 of agenda item D3. How about adding whether those charged with governance is fully aware of their responsibilities regarding the establishment of the internal control system. And last comment is regarding the last comment regarding the communication with appropriate external parties. I support the new provisions for communication with appropriate external parties as a last resort for auditors. I also agree with the fact that it is clearly stated that responses are required only when there are relevant laws and regulations in each jurisdiction. Thank you.
Thank you, Karhita, for your points. Hyson?
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Josephine, for presentation. Really, it was a very good one, and we'd like to appreciate the work that has been made by Task Force on Going Concern. Of course, we support the idea of restructuring ISA 570 to align with the ISA 315, and this will be very good because will save the purpose. All the work done, we support, and we agree with, for example, the terminology that definition, but I support the comment of Mr. Akito with regarding to having the consistency in terminology. So the communication with IAASB, International Accounting Standard Boards should continue in order to have the same one for audit and for financial reporting. We agree with the proposals that are made, for example, for the timeline, and also for making some differentiation when it is related with the transparency for all entities and licit entities as well. So we fully support, and this is very good for increasing really the quality of audit. Thank you.
Thank you, Hyson. Hilda?
Thank you, Jim. And thank you, Josephine, for the presentation. Overall, happy with the way in which this is going. As you know, Accounts Europe has done quite some work on going concern. So happy to see a number of the ideas we had before materialize. One thing we also have been keen on to point out is that there is no silver bullet in addressing these concerns. So a holistic approach, different parties working together is key here. From that point of view, it is a bit of a disappointment that IAASB will not take a project forward on going concern, but we are very supportive you continue to follow what they will do. We hope that they at least not turn back where they are at this point in time. So it would be good to see where this is going. As I said, we are overall supportive. One thing that has stirred up some discussion, and I have to say mixed views, is this change in the commencement date of the going concern assessment period. And I think maybe it's informative for you to know a bit what is behind those mixed views. Some are supportive of this, and oftentimes that's because they already do this in their country, and they are supported to do this to have that requirement also for prepares for companies in the reporting framework, and but sometimes even in their legal framework. So they don't have those issues like Klaas and Akihito referred to. Others are more reserved, and they say, well, if you want to extend the period, because that's what it comes down to, we can see that's very much in the public interest. So why would this be for all entities? Why would this not just be for listed entities or public interest entities, question mark. But others feel that the approach should be the same no matter what type of an entity you are. And the ones that are potentially most reluctant to the change are, where, they are wondering, we as an auditor would need to, force our client to extend their period of assessment for going concern. Might not be easy. We don't have a reporting framework basis or a legal basis to do that. So what if we would not be able to convince them? There are a number of consequences around this, which we would need to think through quite carefully and see how we can deal with this. And a final comment, we are in a period where there is more and more uncertainty, unfortunately, the war in Ukraine, inflation, the energy prices, what we thought would be a basis for projection and scenario analysis yesterday might not be holding true anymore today, and that is adding a level of, I would say, nervousness and uncomfortability around this. Me as an auditor, how can I assess this? Management might have real issues to do this. How can we, bring this to a good end? How can we do this? How long will this, be able to be representative? And it's a true concern that is difficult to address in the standard, but it is there. So potentially something to reflect on. Thank you.
Thank you, Hilda. Certainly we have a lot of uncertainties these days. Greg, I thought you might have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. So I was looking at this from a public sector perspective, and I'm of two minds. On the one hand, I fully support the going concern concept, and I recognize it's present in many accounting frameworks, including public sector frameworks, and therefore it's applicable. At the same time, I look at the transparency proposal for audit reporting, and I really wonder about the perception impact that will have on readers of the auditor's report, who may wonder if the auditor really understands the business that they're auditing. So while there will be circumstances of government or public sector entities where the going concern assumption is a risk and is to be assessed, and may have even been a close call, there may be other cases where it's very straightforward. And the presence of a reporting requirement that for all entities, I'm not convinced that that's appropriate for public sector. So I don't know how to solve that. I don't know if it's about softening the reporting such that for certain entities, perhaps the going concern transparency reporting is more about a description of the auditor's responsibilities than it is about an explicit discussion or statement on going concern. But I do have that concern that public sector isn't necessarily fully reflected in the proposals so far, and I think it requires or should have some further reflection in order to come up with a proposal that is fit for purpose for the public sector.
Thank you, Greg. I'll echo your comments on that. Now we are coming up on our time frame here. Natasha.
Hi, all. Thank you very much. I'll try and be brief. I agree with many of the comments that went before, but I won't remember everybody's name who said them. But just to start with Hilda talking about the current environment and how things are changing in rather extreme ways quite quickly at the moment, I think that's a really important starting point in context for why this work is so relevant now and reasonably urgent. I think there were points made about management bias and of course considering that as a possibility. I would, I'm afraid, say that it's reasonably inevitable the management will be biased. They're an interested party in this. Generally speaking, their incentive packages are closely tied up with this. So I think the starting point and default should be that there is bias there, and therefore the professional skepticism, of course, needs to be very, very robust. I really like the point, I think it was Barb who made about the external signals and ensuring reference to that. I'm thinking specifically about the equity in the bond markets. Often, inevitably rather forward-looking, will pick up and express nervousness around the sustainability of a business before it seems that the management or the auditor does. And I think, therefore, being cognizant of that and explicitly referencing those moves and understanding them is important. I would, though, add that there is circularity there, so we need to be important that, you know, the auditors aren't feeding off signals from the market, which are feeding off, you know, the accounts somehow. So, you know, it just needs to be assessed, but ignoring it, I think, is a bad idea. Timeline, I really feel very, very strongly this point of at least 12 months is really key. And I don't know whether analysis has been done about how many do more than 12 months, but I've hardly ever seen it, if ever. And I think it's really, really important that there is pushback from the auditor where they feel that's appropriate. And I would also say that within the investment community, I think there's not always a full understanding that when you're looking for 12 months, that's about things, you know, in a way, within the next 12 months, the market may respond very negatively to something that will happen further in the future. Right, and that could then put the business at risk within the next 12 months. So we're looking at events and conditions that are actually potentially much further into the future, and I would include climate risk into that. And I do think that needs to be much clearer to the market so they really understand that. And indeed, I'd like to see management and auditors talking about that a little bit more fully. Finally, transparency. I think it's great to have more transparency. I'm actually a little bit different from the previous comment in that from an investor perspective for publicly listed entities, we would like to see more. I think a discussion of, you know, what the auditor has done is helpful, but actually I think we also need to see the results of what they did. We need to understand what conclusions then they derive, not just we did these procedures, because that just kind of leaves us hanging. So more on that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. I have 3 more comments. We are hitting a time frame here, so if you could keep them brief. Dawn?
Thanks, Josephine. I will be very brief. In terms of the terminology, we support the definition of material uncertainty, and the clarification in the application material is very helpful. The timeline, we have a lot of concerns, so I'm going to echo a lot of what the other speakers have already said. Our view is that there should be alignment between the management responsibility and the responsibilities of the auditor. There shouldn't be a mismatch from the accounting standard, and I think that's going to give us a lot of heartburn in terms of how we will reconcile that. The other thing too is I just question whether or not it makes sense if the IAASB has deferred that project, whether we should be doing any tweaking with it now. But, you know, I'm aware that it's being monitored, so at least that's a good thing. The transparency, the auditor's report, you know, the timeline is really what gives us a lot of concern there, and how we can extend and report on that when what is the material that we should be looking at that's going to be extended beyond that period, and how do we reflect that in the report? I think it's going to be a lot of increased risk. It's going to create further expectation gaps, and I think there's going to be a lot of costs that's going to have to be passed along to the client, because we're going to have to reach out to legal counsel in those situations that are sensitive, just for opinion on how we can report. So thanks.
Thank you. Let's see, Paul.
Thank you, Jim. This is maybe more a due process point. IFA for SME is obviously very supportive of to see application of the CUSP drafting principles and guidelines. So we welcome the fact that in, I think it's paragraph 7 of paper D2, there's specific reference to CUSP. Says that the task force applied the CUSP drafting principles and guidelines. I guess that kind of begs the question whether we should be looking for the same treatment of CUSP in every project and specific explicit reference to the application of the CUSP principles. So, for example, in the projects preceding this, the one in particular on audit evidence, I didn't necessarily see any specific reference to the CUSP drafting principles. So I just wonder whether it would be good to see that so that we know that it's been done. And in fact, one could perhaps make a case for asking the CUSP working group just to conduct a light independent review of the papers, just to kind of give us some assurance or some comfort around their application. The last very small point, or not so small, I guess, is that paragraphs 38 to 41 of paper D2 describes the scalability application material, and this again is very welcome.
Thank you, Paul. Galen?
Yeah, thank you. Just to follow up, agree with many of the points that have been made. Appreciate the presentation. Agree with the timeline. I think the approval date of the financial statements is, in most cases, very close to the issuance date, and that's very consistent with what we've been using in the U.S. for some time, and it eliminates ability of management to manipulate the time periods to suit their own purposes. Following up on Natasha referenced Barb's comment, I think it is very appropriate when only internal information is used in management's assessment. At what point do you need to, or do you ever need to, look at external information outside of the organization? Is that only in close call situations, or are there other circumstances? Or should it always be a consideration? And then sort of a follow-on to that, when is it appropriate for the auditor to develop their own expectation? Could it be constructed in sort of a blind test of management's assessment and sort of a comparative to determine whether you are in a close call situation? Thank you, Jim.
Thank you. Wow, that's a lot of very robust feedback. I will go to Dave to see if you have any points from the PIOB perspective.
Sure, Jim. Thanks very much. First of all, Josephine, thanks for a great presentation, and to everybody for their feedback. I think that's been really useful, and it has highlighted some of the challenges that are faced in this project. We're very supportive of this project. We believe that this project, along with fraud and sustainability assurance, are some of the highest priority projects of the IAASB. And it's important in this project that in developing the standard that we're able to see how this strengthens the audit procedures that are performed and the transparency regarding this matter, and how this has the potential to reduce that expectation gap. And as we heard in the comments, there are some differing views in those areas. I agree with Barb and others on their comments about considering potentially contradictory, also supportive information that's external to the company, and some mention of that, maybe some examples of that might be useful. And then there was a lot of discussion about the period of time. I'm supportive of the 12 months from the date the financial statements are approved, but I also agree. I think Hildy had some very good comments about the problem that is created by the IAASB, the IASB, pardon me, not taking up the project. It's certainly much more effective if the IASB informs management on how to prepare the financial statements rather than the auditor. However, this has been going concern has been an issue that has been the auditor's issue, not management's, presumably, for a long time. So some application guidance here to assist the auditor in ways to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence under the circumstances would be important. And then the transparency, I think, is a key issue, and examples in that area will also be very useful. Thanks a lot, Jim.
Thank you, Dave. Wow, Josephine, a lot of different perspectives, a lot of comments to think about. Do you have any any general responses for the group?
Yes, I'm sorry. I know we're pushing time, and I apologise. Obviously, very, very important topic, and I really do appreciate all this feedback. It's wonderful. In terms of looking at external sources, we're totally on top of that. It's going to form part of some of our next thinking, and hopefully in December, Bob and others who raised that, you'll see some of that coming through in the material. We just haven't had a chance to just quite get to that point yet, but yeah, I mean, absolutely really good to hear the support for that, because that's coming up, so we've already nailed that one. Definitely heard noises about boilerplate. Yes, we have tried very hard in the application material to make sure that the auditor can be as specific about the circumstances of the entity as possible, but of course we'll have another look. We'll stand back, have another look at that, see if that's absolutely crystal clear. The other point I did want to make is I do want to come back to this transparency, this commencement date. And I do understand there is some tension there, but certainly we have to, I think, and Hilda, you said it, because you said it's mixed views. It is a minimum period that most accounting standard setters talk about. The minimum period of. So there is, I don't want to say an expectation, but there is certainly that flexibility that in certain circumstances, even the accounting standard setters would expect the management just to think out longer. So if you're thinking about even from the commencement date, that's thinking out longer than 12 months from the balance sheet date. So there is that flexibility. But also in those situations where you do have management, say, for example, pushing back, and so you have a shorter period than required in the auditing standards, we now have introduced that discussion you have with management about it. Previously, you go straight to potentially a modified opinion and the impact on the auditor's report, but there is that conversation to be had, and through that process should be able to draw that evidence needed from management's perspective and the auditor's perspective. And also it's just, reinforcing that message to users that they are receiving current information and not something that might have been 9 months ago or so far ago. So that's really important. And to Hilda and Natasha's point, particularly given the situation globally that we're in now. The other couple of points I just wanted to make is that we'll also obviously continue our engagement with the IAASB and update them on the project and make sure that we are aligned with terminology as far as possible. Sometimes it's our terminology for our standards, and so it's not so easy, but in most cases we do try to align as much as possible. And CUSP principles, thank you very much. Yes, we have the CUSP working group chair on our task force. So from that perspective, she keeps us razor sharp focus on the changes we're making. So thanks for those comments. But generally, I do believe those were the key points I wanted to make. Sorry, just give me a second, make sure I've got everything in terms of high level. But yes, I mean, we're taking all of this on board. Thank you ever so much for the comments, all really, really helpful in going forward. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Josephine. Josephine, I appreciate your time to come listen to the CAG, and I thought we had a very lively session. So finally, for today, we're going to move on to the ASB strategy and work plan. It seems like we just finished one, but we have a triumvirate of people here, Tom, Billy, and Jasper, who are going to talk about the next plan. So I will turn it over now.
It does feel that way, and partly it feels that way, Jim, because we just did a work plan consultation, and so that actually did provide us some good insights to drive in this process. We are aligning our strategy periods with IAASB. That's a particularly important point, and we've been coordinated with IAASB as well, so that we present a cohesive front as to independent standard setting boards. So the goal today is to get your feedback as we start to move towards what will be a consultation process on our strategy and work plan that will commence in 2024. And really, if you remember, our strategy that was said previously was really about focusing on public interest issues and committing ourselves to audit quality and through three different ways. One was to finish what was the work on a work program related to audit quality, and that entailed 315, QM standards, group audits, etc. So we could then clear our agenda to talk about do the projects of meanings that exist today. The second thing we focused on was just increasing the agility of our work program so we could be more responsive and try different things from a standard setting perspective, including innovations like using reference groups, getting earlier input, meeting our stakeholders where they want to be met. So, for example, on the fraud project, which you hear about tomorrow, is like an intense engagement with investors on discrete topics, so we don't force people always just to write long comment letters. And then finally was the intensification of our stakeholder relationships. Many of those attributes are still relevant and are part of our day-to-day business. And as we're focusing on what our strategy should be going forward, we wanted to make sure that it was not probably a huge break, but is the next evolution about a continuously improving standard setting organization that wants to be working in the public interest. So if you flip the slide, and I'll just remind you from some terminology that we use from a strategy perspective. We start with our goal, which is really the aspiration we want to achieve as an organization from an external standpoint. Then we talk about our strategic drivers that will be both the risk and the opportunities that may impact our ability to achieve our goal. And then we have strategic objectives, which are the actions, the outputs that we're trying to achieve. And then finally, our actions that are linked to those strategic objectives on how we're going to try to achieve them. So that is just some of the terminology and lingo. You know, it could be different in different organizations, but that's what we've used. And so I just wanted to give you a sense of that structure. So if you see on slide 2 on your deck, we talk about our goal. And so it's slightly different, maybe more streamlined than our previous one, but there's enough number of things that we want to talk about here. Really, this is about creating a globally accepted leading audit assurance related services standards that drive trust, which is the ultimate reason for our being, and evolve in a timely manner. So, you know, there's no guarantee that our standards will be the preeminent ones. We need to constantly earn the market trust. There's always a risk of fragmentation. That's partly what's driving our LCE projects. It's definitely a big driver of our sustainability efforts. We do not want to have fragmentation at a time in which actually there's an element of trends geopolitically in that place. Our goal is that to enhance trust in markets. I know the typo on slide 2, not trusts like a banks, but trust. And that is really the purpose of it, of our work. And then finally, there's a recognition that the world is moving rapidly, and so what must we? And, you know, someone stated it very well in our last board meeting, that timeliness and an ability to evolve is a public interest matter itself. Quality can't live in autarky. You know, much of what we do is a constrained optimization exercise. We need to get the highest quality standards out in the time that's permitted, consistent with our due process. And so that drives a lot of the way we want to improve our work. It drives the topics that we have on our agenda, and really will focus our efforts going forward. I'm going to turn it over. I think Gasper, you're going to take over from me right now, and we look forward to people's comments on the goal and the strategic objectives and the drivers.
Thank you, Tom. Yes, indeed. So I'm indeed taking it over. And Michelle, would you mind going to the next slide? Yeah, so I'm going to guide you through the rest of the strategy, highlight some matters on it. I will be brief given the time where we're at. So as Tom mentioned, like the strategic drivers are really the environmental factors that drive the opportunities and challenges to achieve our goal. And we developed the strategic drivers based on a brainstorm session that we had with the planning committee. And in the June meeting, we organized lunch meetings for the other board members, so they could provide input on this as well. So this is the result of that. You'll see that we grouped the strategic drivers into 3 key themes, and these themes, like the first one of the themes is the increased and more diverse demand for our standards. And I won't highlight all of them, but to give an idea, like for example, like the sustainability reporting has really been picking up. We already had it in our previous strategy as a strategic driver, but it's now way bigger than it was before. So there's more diverse demand for our standards. And on the other hand, you have the regulators who would like to see more specific requirements and more requirements. And then on the other hand, you have auditors of less complex entities who say like these requirements and the ISAs are not proportionate anymore for the audit of a less complex entity. So we need to balance all these demands, and that's been brought out in this first theme. Then the second theme we identified was confronting headwinds to global adoption, and this is really the risk of fragmentation. And just Tom, you mentioned that as well just earlier on. I guess just generally globally, there's more, there's less things are going global and it's more going into regional or maybe on a national level, things are being done. So what we're trying here, like what we are seeing in the audit world is that some jurisdictions go ahead and develop their own standards. They're not waiting for us anymore. Or they are adding a lot to our standards. So that's causing like some fragmentation. And there is also then the risk on sustainability reporting, where also on national, various national standard setters are developing their own sustainability assurance standards. And this is, these are some of the examples that was driving the risk of confronting headwinds to global adoption. So then the third strategic driver, the theme that we identified is changing demands to our ways of working. And it really relates to the partly mainly through the monitoring group reforms. Because of that, we need to make changes to the staff complements and need to attract top talent at the board and staff levels. And then, of course, there's always like the changes in technology that go really quickly, and we need to continue to address that as well. So, Michelle, can you move to the next slides where we see the strategic objectives and the strategic actions. So based on the goal and the strategic drivers, we developed these strategic objectives. So the strategic objectives are necessary to achieve our goal and to address the strategic drivers that we're seeing. So I think it's important to highlight that these are just the matters that we will focus on. Like it's not everything that we do. So the strategic objectives as written out are not mentioned to capture everything that we're doing. So for example, the first strategic objective, enhance the performance of audit engagements by strengthening our auditing standards. It's just purposely focusing on auditing standards and not on, for example, on related services standards that we also have in our suite of standards. It's purposely chosen as we think that focusing on auditing standards will contribute to our goal most. The other matters like all linked to the strategic drivers. For example, the globally accepted standards on assurance and sustainability are linking to what I just mentioned on the developments in that space, and as well the risk of fragmentation. Same with coordination. We think it's very important to also reduce the risk of fragmentation. And then the strategic actions are really as Tom mentioned, like really the specific matters that we will address to meet these strategic objectives. And they really are kind of the linking pin between the strategy as well and our work plan that we'll see, and where Willie will talk about more. So maybe Willie, handing it over to you right now for the work plan.
Thank you, Jasper. And we can go to the next slide, please. So as Jasper has indicated, once we've at the high level set our strategic actions in terms of achieving the strategic objectives, we turned our mind to reflecting on our work plan for 2024 to 2027 in terms of operationalizing those actions. One of the things that we will do within this new strategy period is that we will only have a work plan for the full 4-year period of the strategy, and we will not, as in the past, do every 2-year check-in on the work plan. We will rather have the work plan settled as part of the strategy, and then separately, in more of a type of a living document on our website, update our detailed work plan as we go along. So in section 3 of the proposed consultation paper on our strategy and work plan, we set out our thinking regarding our work plan for 2024 to 2027. And I think there are a few key areas that I just wanted to highlight. The first thing that you would have noticed is we made this point very specifically regarding going forward, maintaining the balance between audits and reviews of financial statements and sustainability and other assurance engagements. It is very important that the audits and reviews, and especially audits of financial statements, will remain a key priority area for us, because we do realize that financial statements are and will continue to be the core of the financial reporting ecosystem. Alongside this, we also believe that the recent developments, especially in the respect of sustainability, and we believe there will probably be a bigger and more general focus on non-financial information going forward, that sustainability and other assurance engagements will also be a priority for us. So it is important that we balance those two key areas. In the context then of maintaining that balance, the proposed work plan then looks forward in terms of how do we think we will undertake our work within this 4-year period. So that starts obviously with the progressing and completing of our projects that are underway at the start of 2024. And that is set out in table A within the work plan, where we take the perspective on the 5 projects that will still be, the 6 projects that will still be ongoing at the start of 2024, and how we anticipate that those projects will be completed as we go into this new work plan period. We also draw attention to the fact that apart from those 6 projects that will be ongoing, we also have other initiatives that also consume staff resources and as needed board resources and plenary time, in terms of our consultation groups for some of our pervasive topics like technology, professional skepticism and auditor reporting. And then what also consumes or that competes for our time and attention is also the extent to which there may be a need for the development of support materials or non-authoritative guidance. So again, that also has to be balanced in terms of the actual project work that we undertake. Then a big section in the proposed work plan is our next projects for the work plan period. So I think the key points that are being made there is that the board's decision in terms of which topics come onto the work plan and when will very much be driven by the criteria in our framework for activities. And you'll remember this consultative advisory group was also part of when we finalized the framework for activities at the beginning of last year. So we are implementing that fully in terms of the criteria within the framework for activities will determine when certain projects move forward. We've given an indication that based on the work that is underway at the start of 2024 and our expectations regarding how those projects will complete, we need to build up, and as those projects complete, we need to commence new projects. We've also taken into account initial expectations about the possible impact of changes resulting from the implementation of the monitoring group reforms, and therefore concluded that going forward, it is feasible to work on the basis that we can probably have 5 to 7 parallel projects running at the same time. So in the table at the bottom of page 18, we've given you an indication that as the projects underway complete, we will probably then have space to commence with 1 new project in 2024, 2 to 3 projects in 2025, etc. The net result of all of that is, if you look at any particular point in time, and I've got a serious spreadsheet that lays that out, that you always have at least 6 projects going on. In 2024, we'll probably have 7, and then it stabilizes in the last 3 years that you always have 6 projects going on at the same time. We've also drawn attention to the fact that there might be a call for certain post-implementation reviews to start during this work plan period, just remembering that post-implementation reviews, in terms of the investment and effort they take, equals a project, and therefore they will compete with the other topics in terms of what is regarded as a priority at a particular point in time. And then we've given an indication in table B of the work plan. It starts on page 19 and it goes over to page 19, 20, and 21 of the candidate topics that are most likely to be in line for the next projects, which is very much based, as Tom indicated in the beginning, on our recent work plan consultation that we've done. We believe it is appropriate to refer to those results, and we've indicated the topics that are sort of that have surfaced right to the top of our category A pool of topics, and these are the ones that are probably most ready to go into category B, which means more focused information gathering and research about these topics, identifying the issues, understanding the issues, the root causes of the issues, the global relevance of the issues, so that from there on you move to possible recommendations, project proposal, etc. Those topics are set out in an order of sequence that was indicated by the last work plan consultation, as well as a number of topics that were raised by the respondents to that consultation, which we could obviously not rank because that just came out of the various themes that were identified from the various survey responses that we received. But we do believe by presenting it in this way, this consultation paper gives us a great opportunity to then again reaffirm with our stakeholders if these are really still what our stakeholders believe are the candidate topics, and whether there might have been any changes in the views of our stakeholders. So in both those tables, in terms of the projects underway at the start of 2024, as well as the possible candidate topics to take those spots as the current projects complete and the new projects have to begin. We've also in those tables very deliberately made the split between audits and reviews of financial statements and sustainability and other assurance engagements. Towards the end, we just emphasize the coordination with other standard setting boards, of which the coordination with our sister board, the ethics board, is obviously very key. And then there's a last section that we still just need to do some work on before we take this to the board for final approval in December around the allocation of resources. Next slide, please. Just an indication that, so we can go to the next slide. Michelle, thank you. There we go. Right, so our board will see the consultation paper for the first time next week, and we will have a plenary discussion on that. We then will take the input from the board and turn this around to present the consultation for the board's approval in December. It is also important that I just note that between September and December, the planning committee of the IAASB and the planning committee of the ethics board will also have a joint session, because parallel with us, the ethics board is also progressing their work in terms of developing their strategy and work plan. And we will have a joint meeting of the planning committees in October, just to see what the joint up thinking is, commonalities of interest, and key areas of coordination that we want to emphasize. And then if this is then approved in December 2022, we hope to release the public consultation in January 2023 for a comment period of at least 3 months. So I think we can then go to the questions. And Jim, so I think very simply, we are asking the CAG for any feedback on the draft consultation paper that was set out in agenda item E2. And then obviously any other matters that representatives think we need to take into account as we finalize the consultation paper. Thank you, Jim.
Thanks, Philly, and I'd be curious to hear from the CAG members, any particular areas of support or concern for this new working plan. And I will open it up to see if we have any.
It's so clear, Jim, that universal support. Oh, no, guess not.
Don't speak too soon. The CAG is never shy. Tom, let's see. Wei?
Thanks a lot. I appreciate the work of the amount of work in developing the IAASB strategy and work plan. Looking at the number of priority projects and staff resources, I appreciate careful consideration has been made in determining the timelines and deliverables of key projects. All the projects in the pipeline for the next 2 years are important from the public interest perspective. While I noticed Fraud's project is delayed to 2025, Fraud is one of the key public interest topics, particularly to the capital market stakeholders. The project, I remembered, started 2 years ago in 2020, based on the current projected issuance of the finalized standard in 2025. The potential effective date of the revised fraud standard for the audit of financial period will be, I guess, in 2027. That is 6 or 7 years since the project first started. So I do appreciate all the projects are of high priority. I would also like to note that fraud should be given higher consideration. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Wei. Hyson?
And just a few words. We fully support the strategy and the working plan. Of course, there are clear strategic objectives, actions, and working plan there. I understand quite well that input of stakeholders is very important in drafting the plan and just opening the way of other projects in the future. But my concern or suggestion is what is the way of getting the input for some kind of stakeholders which really do not answer frequently, for example, or very often do not answer, such as SMPs or SMEs. They are not like those that are big entities or big organizations. So have you made any plan how to raise the awareness and how to increase their inputs? Thank you.
Thank you, Hyson. Let's see. Akihito?
Thank you, James. Thank you very much, Tom, Willie, and Jasper for your great presentation. It is very important to clarify the principle of IAASB's standard setting in order to respond consistently with flexibility in the future. So I support the current process and expect to continue to discuss and consider further, also considering various feedbacks. Regarding the contents of the draft consultation paper, the further development of sustainability assurance standard may be the most important in the list possible new standard setting projects in the draft consultation paper, I think. So my suggestion is to add more detailed questions in the consultation paper in order to gather additional information regarding sustainability assurance. Specifically, for example, the challenges and areas or topics to which need to address by developing standards.
And I think that post-implementation review, PIR, of ISSA 5000 also may be included in this consultation paper. It's just my suggestion. And that's all. Thank you very much.
Jim? Did we lose Jim?
Looks like we've lost Jim. I wonder if shall we wait for him or shall Conchita?
No, I think we should continue with the hands.
Yeah. Conchita?
Thank you. I appreciate and our group is supportive of the work plan. And one important thing that I would like to cite is the major constraint that they have in pursuing the projects that they have lined up, and that is budgetary constraint. What has been lined up are worthy to pursue, and the matter on budgetary constraint should be properly addressed so that more may be achieved. And what has been lined up are really consistent with our expectation as far as public interest is concerned. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul, I think.
Well, thank you very much. And yeah, I think my comments are pretty similar to what's already been said. I want to commend you on the, I guess I'll call it the framework. I think that was your term as well. I think that's very important to have a structure, a process, a framework, so that as changes occur, and we know in this rapidly changing world, there will be changes, you can be nimble and agile in terms of determining what the next important projects are. Certainly anything relating to technology and ESG are I think, obvious for the agenda. So I think you're right on target there. And the other thing, I don't know that it's really a question, but we're in a world where talent is becoming a greater and greater problem. And I know you did discuss that, and that's part of your focus is to make sure that you get the right talent to support this. So I guess I don't have a question, but just wanted to reinforce that I think that's going to be a very critical either enabler or inhibitor as you try to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. I lost all my power. How often does that happen during a call like this? But I'm back, I think, for now. Let's see, do we have anyone else in the list?
Yeah, Kazuhiro.
Kazuhiro, thank you.
Thank you. I have a comment regarding the post-implementation review. Unfortunately, users of Japanese financial statements were unable to comment on the post-implementation review of CAM, as full-fledged application in Japan will begin in fiscal 2020. In Japan, after the IAASB has revised developed the standards, the domestic rules will be revised, so the application will inevitably be slightly delayed. So, regarding the setting timing of post-implementation, I would appreciate it if the IAASB could give some consideration to countries where the application is slightly delayed. Thank you.
Thank you, Kazuhiro. I do not see any other hands. Dave, I'm going to see if you want to weigh in here.
Great. Thanks, Jim, and welcome back. Tom, Welly, we're very supportive of the process that you're entering into here, and I look forward to hearing the feedback from from the public on the consultation. I think that will be very important. As has been noted here, the allocation of your limited resources is going to be key to the effective execution of your plan, not only in the short term, but in the long term. I'm going to make a personal comment, so that please don't ascribe this to the PIOB, because I haven't said this to them, certainly. But Tom, I liked the comment you raised that timeliness is in the public interest, and I think that's a really powerful point. But I would also say that the only thing worse than slow standard setting is fast standard setting, and that's because invariably we miss some of the unintended consequences, which is why due process is so important, and groups like this and getting that feedback. So finding the right balance will be an eternal pursuit, I think, for standard setters, and I think pursuing it is really important. But I agree with your point, and I thought that was very, very well made. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dave. And I think that concludes our comments on this particular topic. I'd like to thank Tom, Billy, and Jasper for their presentation. We look forward to see how this next plan develops. And I'm sure we'll be providing more input as we move forward. Okay, well, I think we had a very productive first session. We will be joining again tomorrow and continue on with some other important topics, including fraud, which was referenced several times today. I'd like to thank the CAG members for their participation. To another good session tomorrow, and thank everyone who participated and presented. Thank you for all the task force and all the work and all the support from IAASB staff. So we'll see everyone tomorrow. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.